When it comes to exploitation, a strange disparity occurs. While social movements, NGOs, and activists, like we all on this conference, constantly state and denounce exploitative relationships around the globe, social scientists have been consequently avoiding the term exploitation for about more than 3 decades. Since the 1980s, rent-seeking, closure, or exclusion have replaced the term exploitation as mechanism of social inequality. This disappearance of exploitation from the social sciences goes hand in hand with the academic downfall of Marxist social theory. But another reason can be noted too. Because the term exploitation has often been received as a Marxist quantitative model for the explanation of profits and has been tightly interlinked with the labor theory of value, the downfall of exploitation began when economists started to question massively the validity of the labor theory of value. Since then, neither the labor theory of value nor exploitation play any role, at least in German-speaking inequality studies and sociology in general. Besides that, the focus on profits and competitive markets becomes specifically problematic when we, as feminists, deal with the exploitation of less profitable domestic subsistence or care work. My aim, therefore, is to revitalize the term exploitation because only exploitation describes a specific social relation when somebody takes advantage of another by appropriating the labor of another. This basic idea of the exploitation de l'homme par l'homme, how Marx put it, does not depend on the validity of the labor theory of value and is usable for care work too. My speech contains 4 parts. First, I will speak about the Marxian concept of exploitation and its narrow-minded economic reception. Secondly, I'm going to talk about some intervening feminist contributions in this context and specifically about the relation between domestic labor and the labor theory of value. Thirdly, I will present some problems of these feminist contributions, and finally, I will introduce a way of rethinking exploitation in regard of care work and state-regulated quasi-markets. The Marxian concept of exploitation. The term exploitation has been firstly elevated to the dignity of an analytical scientific term within the work of Marx. Marx himself used the term in various ways to describe strategic political opportunities, extractivism, or colonialism. In summary, Marx developed the term exploitation, like other categories within his work, on different levels of abstraction. Firstly, he used a basic understanding of the exploitation de l'homme par l'homme, that is simply to say that somebody takes advantage of another. Subsequently, he expanded the term for analyzing special historical class societies and how the private appropriation of collectively produced surplus was taking place. Though Marx used exploitation to describe every class society since ancient times, his value-theoretical concept of capitalistic exploitation became especially famous. Maybe the reason for this is that, following Marx, capitalistic exploitation is conceptualized as a paradox, namely a difference based on equivalence. According to that, surplus occurs within formally free exchange relations on competitive markets. According to that, commodities are exchanged due to their exchange value, and nevertheless, surplus is created. That's the paradox I'm talking about. The institutional context Marx had in mind when he spoke about capitalistic exploitation mainly was the industrial production of goods and so-called productive labor. Only productive labor that creates capitalistic surplus, thereby is capitalistically exploited. Although Marx himself never thought that the exchange of equivalence could come along without any economic dependence, unfreedom, and compulsion of the working class, many Marxists and non-Marxist economists since the 1960s received his concept of capitalistic exploitation mainly as a quantitative model for the explanation of profits on competitive so-called free markets. For example, John Römer, the analytical Marxist, asked in 1986, I quote, "What economic institutions appear to be necessary for one producer to appropriate the labor of another? As has been discussed, Marx's task was to construct a theory of exploitation that was operative even when a coercive institution of labor exchange was absent. Even when a coercive institution of labor exchange was absent." That's his understanding of the Marxian concept of capitalistic exploitation. Not only Römer, but many Marxists, even nowadays, think of capitalistic exploitation as something that is exclusively reserved for the profit-driven and non-coercive exchange of commodities deriving only from productive industrial labor on free, competitive, formal markets. Hence, the influence of discrimination and depreciation did not receive appropriate attention within many Marxist economic debates about exploitation. Often Marx's concept of exploitation was and is still focused on the explanation of profit creation. Besides that, it is frequently understood as a concept that deals with free exchange of equivalent relations that are in principle independent from discrimination and coercion. This narrow-minded understanding of Marx's works has fortunately been prominently attacked by several feminists in the 1970s and 80s. Several feminist approaches to exploitation provided at least 3 important insights. First, they understood capitalism as, like Silvia Federici says, as a heterogeneous combination of different types of labor and exploitation. Secondly, feminists have thereby broadened the understanding of capitalistic exploitation by claiming the exploitation of domestic work, and that means the capitalistic exploitation of domestic work. Thirdly, they systematically took the importance of discrimination and exclusion into account. In the context of the debate about domestic work, feminists not only indicated that capitalism systematically exploits domestic and subsistence work around the globe, but disputed whether the exploitation of non-commodified, unpaid domestic work done by housewives could be grasped with the labor theory of value. Linked to this, questions mattered, like whether domestic work lowers the value of the male labor power as a commodity, or whether domestic work itself produces value and could therefore actually be defined as productive. According to Marx, the cost for reproduction of the labor commodity consists in a package of several commodities that are needed to reproduce labor power on a given social reproduction scale. But what Marx did not mention was the unpaid domestic work of women that reproduces the most valuable commodity in capitalist societies, namely labor power. This missing link became one of the central issues of following Marxist feminist debates about the labor theory of value and the importance of domestic work for capital accumulation. One example of these debates has been the controversy between Claudia von Werlhoff and Ursula Beer in the early 1980s. According to Werlhoff, the unpaid subsistence work is the source and unpaid part of capitalistic profits. But this so-called colonial or women rent is not only a valuable part of profits. Following Werlhoff, it is the main source of capitalistic profits. In contrast, Ursula Beer argued that this assumption missed the labor theory of value because unpaid domestic work is consequently disregarded when it comes to profits. Capital thereby ignores unpaid work consequently. Beer argued that Werlhoff had not been able to prove that domestic labor really lowers the value of the labor commodity. Okay. Feminist approaches that deal with unpaid domestic work and subsistence work indeed must come into conflict with the Marxist labor theory of value that consequently does not take these forms of uncommodified work into account. In addition, differing understandings of capitalism play also an important role when it comes to different views on exploitation. While Marxists often assumed that wage labor would become the dominant way of utilizing labor power worldwide, feminists stressed the persistence of pretended pre-capitalistic forms of labor. It also follows that the term exploitation has been understood differently in some feminist approaches. With an eye to the subsistence work of rural peasants of the so-called Third World, the feminist subsistence approach, for example, emphasized the violent and predatory character of exploitation, while Marx himself assumed that violence would by and by lose its importance for the accumulation of capital. Hence, whether you take a look on paid industrial labor and assume its historical generalization or on unpaid domestic work marks an important difference when it comes to different understandings of exploitation. In my opinion, the focusing on the labor theory of value was one central problem of many Marxist feminist debates about domestic work in that time, because this theory also aims to explain how commodities are exchanged for the purpose of profits. Domestic work always needed to be reflected in its relation to male wage labor. Domestic work was only said to be capitalistically exploited because it produced something that was said to be really exploited, namely industrial labor power. The productivity of unproductive work therefore needed to be proved as productive, at least indirectly. As a result, a specific Marxist fixation on profits was introduced into feminist debates as well that actually seek to overcome this narrow-mindedness. This fixation is highly associated with the Marxist concept of capitalistic exploitation and its one-sided economic reception. To sum up, I do not think that the question is really informational, whether the reason why Marx did not mention unpaid domestic work is either the result of his male bias or just a consequent application of the labor theory of value. I'm instead mainly interested in the question how we can grasp the exploitation of so-called unproductive work like care work without moralizing exploitative relationships or unclear explanations. The focusing on profits is especially problematic when it comes to care work, not only because care work is less profitable than the production of goods, but because it is generally done on so-called quasi-markets, which are highly regulated by the state. Quasi-markets are differing from normal markets because of at least two reasons. Firstly, providers, like non-profit organizations, do not primarily seek for profits. Secondly, price formation mechanisms are restricted in favor of budgeting. One appropriate example I've been working on the last 3-4 years is elder care, and especially unpaid elder care in Germany. In Germany, the so-called mixed economy of elder care comprises private providers, but the state and non-profit organizations are important parts of the care market as well. There's no free price formation on this quasi-market because elder care is financed by restricted budgets of the care insurance, private households, and the welfare state. Furthermore, the care insurance only covers a proportion of the costs and leaves the further cost to the private households and the families and social benefits. For most of the small providers on this market, not profits, but black figures are at stake. These are mostly realized by the help of wage dumping. Therefore, exploitation on the care market mainly occurs not as making profit, but as cost reduction. According to the Marxist concept of capitalistic exploitation, we therefore do not need to think primarily of a profitable value difference that creates surplus. On the contrary, we need to think about an exploitative strategy of systematically reducing the prices of labor power. This is an idea that originally derives from Rainer Bauböck and from a text from 1988 that he wrote here in Vienna. I think when exploitation is understood as a social relation wherein one actor takes advantage of another by appropriating a surplus, we also can understand exploitation the other way around as a social relation where one actor takes advantage of another by reducing the costs of labor power. When it comes to the mechanisms of this exploitative wage dumping, feminist approaches are very helpful because they systematically reflect the importance of sexual discrimination, exclusion, and depreciation. when care work is paid less than other work and is done by mostly and specific groups of women, like family members, migrants, or low-skilled workers, the connection between discrimination, exclusion, and exploitation becomes obvious. What the exploited have in common is their social vulnerability that again results from social exclusion and discrimination. Women are discriminated when it comes to decent livelihoods, they earn less, suffer from social insecurity, and are still culturally depreciated or naturalized as caring, loving, and devoted. In accordance, care work is still said to be a labor of love without requiring skills or profession. For this reason, care work done by women can be systematically and specifically exploited. I understand the exploitation on care markets with 3 steps: exclusion, social vulnerability, and appropriation. Social and cost reduction, of course, is the aim of the whole dynamic. Social exclusion therefore produces economic and cultural vulnerability when women are excluded from social security and the labor market and when they are discriminated by sex, race, etc. This vulnerability in turn can be exploited by state and capital, for example. Returning to elder care, Germany delegates much of its elder care work requirements to private households instead of developing public care services for reducing costs, even in times of rising demands. That means not only that the care market with private providers has emerged in Germany over the last 20 years, it means that we can observe an increasing involvement of unpaid or financially badly supported elder care done by family relatives, neighbors, friends, unemployed, migrants, and volunteers too. Against the backdrop of the neoliberal state withdrawal from public care and an increasing demand, the importance of unpaid elder care currently even rises. That is why elder care by mostly female relatives, volunteers, friends, or neighbors, under the heading of so-called caring communities, has been increasingly underlined by social policy and nursing science for some time now. Many thanks for your attention.